The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, its golden rays doing little to warm the cold tension that hung in the air like morning fog. Inside, the grand courtroom buzzed with anticipation, its mahogany panels and brass fixtures bearing witness to countless battles for justice over the decades. Today would be no different, though none present could have imagined just how dramatically this particular case would unfold. Detective Ryan Mitchell sat smugly in the witness box, his crisp uniform pressed to perfection, every badge and button gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At 38, Mitchell carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never truly been challenged, his pale blue eyes scanning the courtroom with an air of superiority that seemed to radiate from his very core. His sandy brown hair was slicked back with precision, and his clean-shaven jaw was set in a line that suggested he had never doubted his own righteousness. Behind him, scattered throughout the gallery, sat his fellow officers from the precinct. Officer Scott Palmer, a burly man with graying temples and arms crossed defiantly over his chest, exchanged knowing glances with Sergeant Davis, whose weathered face bore the kind of cynicism that comes from years of thinking the system always worked in their favor. Their presence was meant to be intimidating, a show of solidarity that said they would stand by their own no matter what. At the defendant's table sat a man whose very presence seemed to command attention without trying. Damon Clark was 45 years old, with rich dark skin that seemed to glow with an inner strength and eyes that held depths of intelligence and experience that would have unsettled anyone paying close attention. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed with military precision, and though he wore a simple navy blue suit, there was something about his bearing that suggested authority, leadership, and a quiet confidence that no amount of false accusations could shake. His posture was impeccable, back straight as if he were standing at attention even while seated. His large hands, which had signed countless federal documents and shaken hands with presidents, now rested calmly folded on the polished wooden table. To the casual observer, he might have looked like any other defendant, but those with trained eyes could see something different. Something that spoke of a man accustomed to command rather than submission. Beside him sat Isaiah Washington, a young black attorney whose nervous energy was barely contained beneath his carefully controlled exterior. At 32, Isaiah had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law, but had spent most of his career handling civil rights cases and police misconduct suits. This case had fallen into his lap through a series of circumstances he still couldn't quite believe, and the weight of representing someone he knew was innocent pressed heavily on his shoulders. Isaiah's dark eyes darted between his notes and the jury box, where 12 faces looked back with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. He adjusted his burgundy tie for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit his client had noticed but chose not to comment on. The young lawyer had no idea he was representing one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country, a secret that would soon transform this entire proceeding in ways no one could predict. The incident that had brought them all here had occurred 3 months earlier on a warm evening in September. Damon had been visiting his elderly mother in the neighborhood where he grew up, a working-class area that had seen better days but still held the warmth of community that had shaped him into the man he became. After spending the evening helping her with some repairs around her small house, he had walked to the corner store to buy her favorite ice cream, a small gesture of love that had become their tradition during his visits. The store was just 4 blocks from his mother's house, a journey he had made countless times as a child. The streets were familiar, lined with modest homes and small businesses that had served the community for decades. Children played on stoops while their parents sat on porches, catching up on neighborhood news and enjoying the cooling evening air. It was the kind of scene that reminded Damon why he had dedicated his life to protecting communities like this one. He had been walking back, plastic bag in hand, when the patrol car pulled up beside him. The engine's rumble cut through the peaceful evening sounds, and the sudden appearance of flashing lights sent a chill through the warm air. Detective Mitchell stepped out of the driver's seat, his hand already resting on his service weapon in a gesture that immediately escalated the tension of what should have been a routine interaction. Officer Palmer emerged from the passenger side, his bulk casting a shadow across the sidewalk as he positioned himself to Damon's right, effectively boxing him in. The tactical positioning was deliberate, designed to intimidate and control, a move that spoke to their intentions from the very beginning. Mitchell's voice cut through the evening air with the sharp edge of authority, unchecked by wisdom or restraint. His opening words would later be dissected in federal courtrooms and congressional hearings, but in that moment they simply hung in the air like a challenge thrown down by ignorance itself. "What we got here, Palmer," Mitchell said with a sneer that twisted his features into something ugly. "Another troublemaker thinking he owns the neighborhood." The words dripped with assumptions and prejudices that had been festering in his mind for years, finally given voice in what he thought was a consequence-free encounter. Damon had faced down terrorists in classified briefings and stared across negotiation tables at some of the most dangerous criminals in the world, but this moment required a different kind of courage. The courage to remain calm when every instinct told him to assert his authority, to reveal who he was and watch these officers crumble with embarrassment and fear. Instead, he chose the harder path, the one that would ultimately serve justice better than any immediate satisfaction. "Evening, officers," Damon said, his voice steady and respectful, carrying just a hint of the authority that commanded rooms full of federal agents and government officials. "Can I help you with something?" The question was genuine, though he already knew the answer would reveal more about these officers' character than they intended to show. Mitchell's laugh was harsh and grating, the sound of a man who had never learned that respect is earned, not demanded. "Help us?" he repeated, his voice rising with mock amusement. "Boy, you can help us by explaining what you're doing creeping around this neighborhood after dark?" The word "boy" fell from his lips like a slap, laden with centuries of disrespect and dehumanization. Palmer chuckled from his position, the sound low and menacing. "Probably casing houses, looking for his next score." The accusation was baseless, built on nothing more than the color of Damon's skin and the officer's own prejudices, but it would form the foundation of the charges that would eventually bring them all to this courtroom. Damon felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders, the same burden carried by countless others who had stood where he now stood, facing accusations built on assumption rather than evidence. But unlike many others, he carried something else as well, the knowledge that this moment would not end with his defeat, that these officers had picked the wrong man on the wrong night. "I'm visiting my mother," Damon explained calmly, shifting the bag of ice cream to his other hand in a movement so natural it should have diffused any reasonable suspicion. "She lives just down the street. I bought her some ice cream." The simple truth of his statement should have ended the encounter right there, but truth was not what these officers were interested in finding. Mitchell stepped closer, invading Damon's personal space in a move designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever he had already decided to do. "Your mother?" he said with exaggerated disbelief. "Right. And I suppose you just happened to be walking around with a bag full of evidence." The logical leap was so absurd it would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. "It's ice cream," Damon repeated, his voice maintaining its calm despite the absurdity of the situation. "You can check if you want." The offer was reasonable, an attempt to de-escalate a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence or public safety. But Mitchell had no interest in de-escalation. His mind had already written the script for this encounter, and he was determined to see it through to its predetermined conclusion. "Oh, we'll check all right," he said, his hand moving to his handcuffs with the practiced motion of someone who had done this many times before. "But first, you're going to assume the position." The phrase hung in the air like a declaration of war against justice itself. Damon knew he could end this immediately with 3 words: Federal Bureau investigation. His credentials were in his wallet, his badge in his jacket pocket. One phone call to his office would bring a convoy of federal agents to this street corner within minutes. But revealing his identity now would solve nothing beyond this immediate injustice. It would not address the systemic problem that allowed officers like Mitchell and Palmer to terrorize communities with impunity. So instead, Damon made a choice that would reverberate through the justice system for months to come. He complied with their illegal demands, allowed them to search his person and his bag of ice cream, submitted to handcuffs and the humiliation of being arrested on his own mother's street for the crime of existing while black. He made the choice to let this injustice play out completely, to gather every piece of evidence needed to not just clear his own name, but to expose and dismantle the corruption that had made this encounter possible. The arrest itself was a masterclass in police misconduct. Despite finding nothing more incriminating than vanilla ice cream and a receipt proving his story, Mitchell proceeded with charges of loitering, resisting arrest, and threatening an officer. Palmer corroborated every lie, their stories aligning with the practiced ease of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. As they drove him to the station, their conversation in the front seat revealed the depth of their arrogance and the completeness of their certainty that they would face no consequences for their actions. Their words, captured on the dashboard camera they had forgotten was recording, would later become exhibits in a federal investigation that would shake their department to its foundations. At the station, Damon was processed like any other arrestee, photographed and fingerprinted by officers who had no idea they were handling one of the most powerful men in federal law enforcement. He used his one phone call not to summon the cavalry that could have freed him immediately, but to call Isaiah Washington, a young attorney whose reputation for integrity and passion for justice had caught the attention of federal monitors watching for exactly this kind of case. The booking sergeant, a tired-looking man nearing retirement, processed Damon with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had seen it all before. But even he seemed puzzled by the charges, glancing between the paperwork and this dignified man who seemed so completely out of place in the booking room. There was something about the defendant that didn't fit the narrative described in Mitchell's report, something that suggested there was much more to this story than appeared on the surface. As Damon sat in the holding cell that night, surrounded by the sounds and smells of institutional justice, he thought about his mother waiting for ice cream that would never come, wondering where her son had disappeared to during such a simple errand. He thought about the countless others who had sat in similar cells for similar non-crimes, men and women who didn't have federal badges to flash or armies of agents to call for backup. Most of all, he thought about justice, and how sometimes the path to achieving it requires allowing injustice to run its full course first. Tomorrow would begin a legal battle that would test not just the charges against him, but the entire system that had allowed those charges to exist. The officers celebrating their successful arrest had no idea they had just set in motion their own downfall. The morning sun was setting behind the courthouse now, and the day's events had only just begun to unfold. In a few hours, Detective Mitchell would take the stand to tell his version of events, confident in his ability to convince a jury that a federal law enforcement director was nothing more than a common criminal caught in the act. The irony was so profound it would have been poetic if the stakes weren't so serious. But Damon sat calmly at the defense table, his hands folded, his expression serene, waiting for the moment when truth would finally have its day in court. He had spent months preparing for this battle, not by crafting elaborate defenses or legal strategies, but by simply allowing the truth to remain unchanged and intact, waiting for its moment to shine through the darkness of prejudice and corruption. The real trial was about to begin, and Detective Mitchell had no idea that his greatest mistake wasn't arresting an innocent man, but choosing to target the one person with both the power and the patience to ensure that justice would finally be served. The courtroom seemed to pulse with barely contained energy as the morning session prepared to begin. Judge Eleanor Hartwell, a distinguished woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back into an elegant bun, surveyed the assembled crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had presided over countless cases, but sensed this one might be different. Her black robes rustled softly as she settled into her chair, the sound somehow adding to the gravity of the moment that was about to unfold. Judge Hartwell had built her reputation on fairness and thoroughness, qualities that had earned her respect from both prosecutors and defense attorneys throughout her 20-year career on the bench. She had seen every type of case imaginable, from petty theft to capital murder, but something about the defendant at the table below caught her attention. There was a stillness about him, a quality of patient authority that seemed unusual for someone facing criminal charges. District Attorney Robert Hayes stood at the prosecution table, his tall frame draped in an expensive charcoal gray suit that spoke to his political ambitions as much as his legal acumen. At 52, Hayes had never lost a high-profile case, a record he attributed to his ability to read juries and craft narratives that resonated with their prejudices and preconceptions. His steel-gray hair was perfectly styled, and his piercing blue eyes held the confidence of a man who had never doubted his ability to secure a conviction. Hayes had built his career on law and order rhetoric, positioning himself as the champion of public safety and the enemy of those who would threaten the peace of law-abiding citizens. This case seemed tailor-made for his brand of justice. Clear-cut police work resulting in the arrest of someone who had clearly been up to no good. The fact that the defendant was represented by a young, relatively inexperienced attorney only made Hayes more confident in his ability to secure another victory. Isaiah had spent the previous night poring over every detail of the case file, his small apartment littered with legal documents, witness statements, and police reports. The young attorney had been admitted to the bar just 5 years earlier, but he had thrown himself into civil rights work with the passion of someone who understood that the law could be either a tool of oppression or liberation, depending on how skillfully it was wielded. His client remained an enigma, even after months of preparation. Damon had answered every question truthfully, but with an economy of words that suggested he was accustomed to keeping his own counsel. There was something about the man that commanded respect, an inner strength that seemed unshakable despite the circumstances he faced. Isaiah had handled dozens of police misconduct cases, but never with a client who seemed so completely unfazed by the prospect of criminal charges. The gallery behind them buzzed with conversation as spectators filed in for what promised to be an interesting trial. Local news reporters occupied the front rows, their cameras and notepads ready to capture whatever drama might unfold. Behind them sat community members who had heard about the case through church networks and civil rights organizations, people who had come to witness what they hoped would be a rare victory against police misconduct. In the back rows, Detective Mitchell's supporters had gathered in a show of solidarity. Captain Lewis, a gruff man with 30 years on the force, sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a line that suggested he viewed this entire proceeding as an attack on law enforcement itself. Beside him, other officers from the precinct maintained their own expressions of grim determination, their presence intended to remind everyone that they stood behind their colleague. Officer Palmer sat directly behind Mitchell, occasionally leaning forward to whisper words of encouragement. His massive frame filled the wooden bench, and his eyes periodically swept the courtroom as if looking for threats to their narrative. These men had testified in countless trials before, their word rarely questioned, their version of events almost never challenged successfully. Today was supposed to be no different. The bailiff's voice cut through the morning chatter with the authority of ritual and tradition. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Hartwell. The courtroom rustled as everyone stood, the sound of fabric and shifting bodies creating a brief symphony of respect for the institution of justice, even as that institution prepared to be tested in ways none of them expected. Judge Hartwell entered with measured steps, her robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench. Her eyes swept the courtroom once more before she settled into her chair and nodded to the bailiff. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Court is now in session in the matter of the People versus Damon Clark." The judge's gaze fell on the prosecution table first, as protocol demanded. "Mr. Hayes," she said with the neutrality that defined her approach to every case, "you may present your opening statement." Hayes rose smoothly, his movements practiced and confident. He had delivered hundreds of opening statements, but this one felt particularly important, not just for the conviction he was seeking, but for the message it would send about supporting law enforcement in their difficult and dangerous work. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hayes began, his voice carrying the rich tones of a man comfortable with being the center of attention. "This case is about respect for law and order, and what happens when that respect breaks down." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the 12 faces in the jury box, cataloging their expressions and looking for the connections he would need to build his case. "The evidence will show that on the evening of September 15th, Detective Ryan Mitchell and Officer Scott Palmer were conducting routine patrol duties in a neighborhood that has experienced increased criminal activity in recent months. Their job," Hayes continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone he reserved for discussions of police work, "was to protect the law-abiding citizens of that community from those who would do them harm." Hayes moved closer to the jury box, his presence filling their field of vision. "During their patrol, they observed the defendant loitering in front of a closed business, behavior that any reasonable officer would find suspicious. When they approached to investigate, as was their duty and their right, the defendant became hostile and uncooperative." The prosecutor's voice hardened as he built toward the climax of his narrative. "Rather than simply answering their questions and cooperating with a lawful police investigation, the defendant chose to escalate the situation. He became verbally abusive, physically threatening, and ultimately forced these officers to take him into custody for their own safety and the safety of the community." Hayes paused again, his timing perfected through years of courtroom drama. "This is not a complicated case," he told the jury. "This is about a man who thought he was above the law, who believed he could intimidate and threaten police officers without consequences. The evidence will show that Detective Mitchell and Officer Palmer acted appropriately and professionally in the face of threatening behavior, and I ask you to hold the defendant accountable for his actions." As Hayes returned to his seat, the confidence in his bearing was unmistakable. He had laid out a narrative that fit comfortable preconceptions, a story that asked the jury to simply trust the word of sworn officers over that of a man who had clearly been in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong attitude. Isaiah stood slowly, his youth apparent in contrast to Hayes's polished confidence. But there was something in the young attorney's bearing that suggested depth beyond his years, a seriousness of purpose that commanded attention even from those predisposed to dismiss him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isaiah began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "my client is an innocent man who was arrested for the crime of walking while black in his own neighborhood." The words hung in the air like an accusation, direct and uncompromising in their simplicity. Isaiah moved toward the jury box, his steps measured and deliberate. "The prosecution wants you to believe that a man walking home with ice cream for his elderly mother somehow posed a threat that required arrest and criminal prosecution. They want you to believe that asking questions about why he was being detained makes someone dangerous and deserving of criminal charges." The young attorney's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But the evidence will show something very different. The evidence will show that Detective Mitchell and Officer Palmer approached my client without reasonable suspicion, detained him without cause, and arrested him without evidence of any wrongdoing. The evidence will show that the only crime committed that night was the violation of my client's constitutional rights by officers who let their prejudices override their professional duties." Isaiah paused, his gaze moving across the jury's faces, looking for signs of openness to the truth he was about to reveal. My client did nothing wrong that night. He committed no crime, threatened no one, and posed no danger to anyone. What he did was refuse to be intimidated by officers who expected him to be grateful for their harassment. What he did was maintain his dignity in the face of injustice, and for that, he sits here today accused of crimes he did not commit. The attorney returned to his table, his presence somehow larger despite his physical youth. The truth, he concluded, has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, I trust you will have the courage to acknowledge it and act accordingly. Judge Hartwell nodded as Isaiah took his seat. Mr. Hayes, she said, you may call your first witness. Hayes rose with the confidence of a man about to play his strongest card. The people called Detective Ryan Mitchell to the stand. Mitchell stood and straightened his uniform, every movement calculated to project authority and credibility. As he walked to the witness stand, his fellow officers nodded their support, their expressions conveying absolute confidence in their colleague's ability to tell his story convincingly. The detective placed his hand on the Bible, his voice clear and strong as he took the oath to tell the truth. The irony was lost on everyone except Damon, who watched with the patient interest of a man who knew exactly how this story would end. Detective Mitchell, Hayes began once his witness was settled, please tell the court about your experience and training as a law enforcement officer. Mitchell sat up straighter, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had testified many times before. I've been with the Atlanta Police Department for 15 years, he said. I've worked patrol, narcotics, and currently serve as a detective in the Criminal Investigations Division. I've made over 300 arrests and testified in court more than 50 times. The statistics were impressive, designed to establish Mitchell's credibility and experience. Hayes nodded approvingly before continuing. Detective, can you tell us about the events of September 15th that led to the defendant's arrest? Mitchell's gaze flickered briefly to Damon before returning to the prosecutor. Officer Palmer and I were conducting routine patrol in the Riverside district when we observed suspicious activity. He paused, gathering his thoughts or perhaps his lies. We saw the defendant loitering in front of Murphy's Electronics, a store that had been closed for several hours. And what was suspicious about this behavior? Hayes prompted. The area has experienced a significant increase in break-ins and theft over the past several months, Mitchell explained. A man standing alone in front of a closed business after dark fits the profile of someone casing the location for a potential burglary. Hayes nodded as if this conclusion was not only reasonable but inevitable. What happened when you approached the defendant? Mitchell's expression hardened, his voice taking on the tone of injured authority. We identified ourselves as police officers and asked him what he was doing there. Instead of answering our questions, he became immediately hostile and uncooperative. Can you be more specific about his behavior? He raised his voice, began making accusations about police harassment, and refused to provide identification when requested, Mitchell said. His body language became increasingly aggressive, and he made statements that I interpreted as threatening. The detective's testimony continued for another 20 minutes, each detail carefully crafted to support the charges while painting Damon as the aggressor in an encounter that should have been routine. Mitchell described reaching for weapons that were never reached for, resistance that never occurred, and threats that were never made. His performance was polished and convincing, the product of years of practice in transforming encounters from harassment into arrests. Hayes concluded his direct examination with evident satisfaction, confident that his witness had laid the foundation for a conviction. Mr. Washington, he said with barely concealed condescension, your witness. Isaiah rose slowly, his notepad in hand, but his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. The detective's confident expression wavered slightly as he realized he was about to face cross-examination from someone who might not simply accept his version of events. Detective Mitchell, Isaiah began, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that suggested dangerous waters ahead. You testified that you observed my client loitering in front of a closed business. Is that correct? That's correct, Mitchell replied, his voice slightly less confident than it had been during direct examination. And you interpreted this behavior as suspicious because of recent break-ins in the area? Yes. Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. Detective, how many break-ins had actually occurred at Murphy's Electronics specifically? Mitchell hesitated, clearly not having expected this level of specificity. I don't have the exact number with me. Would it refresh your memory if I told you that Murphy's Electronics has never been burglarized? Isaiah asked quietly. The courtroom stirred as the implication sank in. Mitchell's face flushed slightly. There have been break-ins in the general area, he insisted. Isaiah pressed on. Detective, you testified that my client refused to provide identification when requested. Do you recall what question he asked you before you requested his identification? Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. He asked what he had done wrong. And what was your response to that question? I told him I would ask the questions. So, when a citizen asks why he's being detained, your response is to demand his identification without providing any explanation? That's standard procedure, Mitchell said, his voice growing defensive. Isaiah paused, letting the detective's words hang in the air. Is it standard procedure, detective, to arrest someone for asking questions? The question struck like a physical blow, and Mitchell's composure began to crack visibly. He didn't just ask questions, he said. He was uncooperative and threatening. Let's talk about those threats, Isaiah said, moving closer to the witness stand. You testified that my client made threatening statements. Can you quote exactly what he said that you found threatening? Mitchell's eyes darted toward the prosecution table, seeking help that wasn't coming. He said he wasn't going to take this kind of treatment. Those were his exact words? Something to that effect. Detective Mitchell, do you consider it threatening when someone says they won't accept mistreatment? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Mitchell's face had gone pale, and the confidence that had marked his earlier testimony was rapidly evaporating. I interpreted his tone and demeanor as threatening, he said weakly. Isaiah nodded slowly. We'll return to that, detective, but first, I want to ask you about the evidence you found when you searched my client. We found evidence consistent with criminal activity, Mitchell said, grasping for the narrative he had prepared. You found ice cream, Isaiah said flatly. Vanilla ice cream and a receipt from the corner store dated 20 minutes before your encounter. The courtroom was dead silent now, the weight of truth beginning to shift the atmosphere in ways that everyone could feel but not everyone could yet understand. That could have been a cover story, Mitchell said desperately. A cover story that involved buying ice cream 20 minutes before you encountered him, Isaiah repeated. Detective, have you ever heard of someone using ice cream as a prop for criminal activity? The absurdity of the situation was becoming apparent even to Mitchell's supporters, and the detective's face reddened with embarrassment and growing anger. There could have been other items, he said. But there weren't other items, were there? Isaiah pressed. There was ice cream, a receipt, and a wallet containing identification that would have immediately cleared up any confusion about why my client was in the neighborhood. Mitchell's silence spoke volumes, and Isaiah pressed his advantage. Detective, did you check the identification in my client's wallet before arresting him? We arrested him for his behavior, not his identity, Mitchell said, the admission more damaging than he realized. So you arrested a man carrying ice cream and a receipt from a local store in his own neighborhood for asking questions about why he was being detained. Mitchell's jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to respond. He was acting suspicious. Acting suspicious by walking with ice cream? Isaiah asked. Or acting suspicious by being black? The question struck the courtroom like lightning, and Hayes leaped to his feet with an objection that Judge Hartwell sustained. But the damage was done, the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Isaiah returned to his table, his cross-examination having accomplished exactly what he intended. Detective Mitchell sat in the witness stand looking like a man who had just realized he was drowning, his confident facade shattered by the simple application of logic and truth to his fabricated story. The morning session was far from over, but already the dynamics in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a straightforward case of law enforcement doing their job was beginning to look very different under the harsh light of scrutiny. And Damon sat calmly at the defense table, his expression unchanged, watching justice slowly but inexorably begin to assert itself. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting geometric patterns across the floor that seemed to shift and change as clouds moved overhead. The morning session had ended with Detective Mitchell looking substantially less confident than when he had first taken the stand, and the buzz of conversation during the lunch recess suggested that public opinion was beginning to shift in ways that made the prosecution uncomfortable. Judge Hartwell called the court back to order with her customary efficiency, but even she seemed more alert than usual, her judicial instincts telling her that this case was developing complexities that went far beyond the simple criminal charges outlined in the indictment. She had watched Isaiah's cross-examination of Detective Mitchell with growing interest, recognizing the work of an attorney who understood not just the law but the deeper currents of justice that flowed beneath it. Hayes stood to continue his case, his morning confidence somewhat diminished by the beating his star witness had taken under cross-examination. The district attorney was experienced enough to know when a case was developing problems, but he was also too committed to his narrative to change course now. The political implications of losing a high-profile case were too significant to contemplate, and he was determined to press forward regardless of the mounting evidence that his version of events might not align with reality. "The prosecution calls Officer Scott Palmer," Hayes announced, his voice carrying forced confidence as he summoned his second witness to shore up the foundation that Mitchell's testimony had begun to crack. Palmer stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the gallery bench like a mountain deciding to walk. At 6'4" and weighing nearly 250 pounds, he presented an intimidating figure even in the formal setting of the courtroom. His uniform was pressed and his badge polished, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he viewed this entire proceeding as an unnecessary formality that was keeping him from more important work. As Palmer made his way to the witness stand, the floorboards seemed to groan under his weight. His pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of knowing that most people would automatically defer to his size and position. When his gaze fell on Damon, there was a flicker of something that might have been recognition, though neither man acknowledged it. Palmer took the oath with the same mechanical precision that Mitchell had shown, his deep voice carrying easily through the courtroom as he swore to tell the truth. The irony was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except the officers themselves, who seemed to believe their own fabrications so completely that they might have passed polygraph tests. "Officer Palmer," Hayes began once his witness was settled, "you were present during the incident involving the defendant on September 15th. Can you confirm Detective Mitchell's account of what transpired that evening?" Palmer's response was as carefully rehearsed as his partner's had been. "I can confirm that everything Detective Mitchell told this court is accurate. We approached the defendant because his behavior was suspicious, and he immediately became hostile and uncooperative." The testimony continued along predictable lines, Palmer corroborating every detail of Mitchell's story with the kind of precision that would have been remarkable if it had been genuine. Every threatening gesture, every aggressive statement, every justification for the eventual arrest was confirmed with unwavering certainty. But as Palmer spoke, Isaiah noticed something that the prosecution had apparently missed. The officer's account was too perfect, too precisely aligned with Mitchell's testimony to be credible. Real events have rough edges, contradictory details, and the kind of human inconsistencies that make them believable. Palmer's testimony had none of these qualities, reading instead like a script that had been memorized and rehearsed until every inflection was calculated for maximum impact. Hayes concluded his direct examination with evident satisfaction, clearly believing that Palmer's imposing presence and unwavering support for Mitchell's story would be enough to overcome any doubts that the morning's cross-examination might have planted in the jury's minds. "Your witness, Mr. Washington," Hayes said with barely concealed smugness as he returned to his table. Isaiah rose slowly, his notepad in hand, but his attention focused entirely on the large man sitting in the witness stand. Palmer's confidence was evident in his posture and expression, but there was also something else there, a kind of wariness that suggested he understood he was about to face questions that might not be as friendly as those he had just answered. "Officer Palmer," Isaiah began, his voice carrying the same quiet intensity that had marked his cross-examination of Mitchell, "you've testified that you witnessed everything that happened during the encounter with my client. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Palmer replied, his deep voice steady and confident. "And you were standing where during this encounter?" "I was positioned to maintain visual contact with the suspect while providing backup for Detective Mitchell." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "So you had a clear view of everything that transpired?" "Yes." "Officer Palmer, how long have you been working with Detective Mitchell?" Palmer considered the question briefly. "About 4 years." "And in those 4 years, how many arrests have you made together?" "I couldn't give you an exact number." "Would it surprise you to know that you and Detective Mitchell have made over 60 arrests together in the past 2 years alone?" Palmer's eyes narrowed slightly. "We work well together. That's why we're partnered." "Indeed," Isaiah said, moving closer to the witness stand. "Officer Palmer, in your testimony just now, you used almost exactly the same words that Detective Mitchell used to describe my client's behavior. Is that a coincidence?" "We saw the same things," Palmer said, but there was a defensiveness creeping into his voice that hadn't been there moments before. "Let me ask you about something specific," Isaiah continued, consulting his notes. "Detective Mitchell testified that my client raised his voice and began making accusations about police harassment. Do you recall my client using those exact words?" Palmer shifted in his seat, his bulk making the chair creak ominously. "He was making complaints about how we were treating him. But did he specifically mention police harassment? Those exact words?" "Something like that." Isaiah paused, letting the evasion hang in the air. "Officer Palmer, you've testified in court before, haven't you?" "Many times. And you understand the importance of being precise about what you actually heard and saw, as opposed to what you think might have happened?" "Of course." "Then let me ask you again. Did my client specifically use the words police harassment, or are you paraphrasing what you think he meant?" Palmer's jaw tightened, and for the first time since taking the stand, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I don't remember his exact words, but Detective Mitchell seemed to remember them quite clearly," Isaiah observed. "In fact, he was very specific about the phrasing. How do you account for that difference in your recollections?" Hayes started to rise with an objection, but Judge Hartwell's sharp look encouraged him to remain seated. The question was fair, and Palmer's discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in the courtroom. "People remember things differently," Palmer said weakly. "Indeed they do," Isaiah agreed. "Officer Palmer, let me ask you about the arrest itself. You testified that my client became physically threatening. Can you describe exactly what physical actions he took that you interpreted as threatening?" Palmer's eyes darted briefly toward Mitchell, who was watching intently from the gallery. He stepped toward Detective Mitchell in an aggressive manner. "How many steps did he take?" It was more about his posture and demeanor." "So he didn't actually step toward Detective Mitchell?" He shifted his weight, moved forward slightly. "Officer Palmer, my client was holding a bag of ice cream. When he allegedly moved forward, what did he do with the bag?" The question seemed to catch Palmer completely off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to remember details that had never actually happened. "I don't recall specifically." "You don't recall what someone did with evidence while they were allegedly threatening a police officer?" Isaiah's voice carried a note of incredulity that wasn't lost on the jury. It happened very quickly. Officer Palmer, how long would you estimate the entire encounter lasted from the time you first approached my client until you placed him under arrest? Maybe 10 or 15 minutes. 10 or 15 minutes, Isaiah repeated. That's quite a while for such a threatening encounter. Can you explain why, if my client was so dangerous and uncooperative, it took that long to arrest him? Palmer's face was beginning to redden, and sweat beads were forming on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. We were trying to de-escalate the situation. By de-escalate, you mean you were trying to calm down a man who was walking home with ice cream for his mother. We didn't know that at the time. Didn't know what? That he had ice cream or that he was walking home to his mother? We didn't know his story was legitimate. Isaiah moved closer to the witness stand, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Officer Palmer, did you or Detective Mitchell ask my client where he lived? Palmer hesitated. I believe Detective Mitchell asked him what he was doing in the area. That's not what I asked. Did anyone ask him where he lived? Not specifically. Did anyone ask him for identification before deciding to arrest him? He was uncooperative. That's not an answer to my question, Officer Palmer. Did you or Detective Mitchell ask my client for identification before placing him under arrest? Palmer's silence stretched for several seconds before he finally answered. Not before the arrest, no. So you arrested a man without knowing who he was, where he lived, or why he was in the neighborhood? We arrested him for his behavior. His behavior of walking with ice cream and asking why he was being detained, Isaiah said flatly. Officer Palmer, in your 4 years of working with Detective Mitchell, how many times have you arrested someone for asking questions? Hayes finally stood. Objection, Your Honor. The question calls for speculation and is irrelevant to the current charges. Sustained, Judge Hartwell ruled, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard the question, and Palmer's obvious distress was impossible to ignore. Isaiah returned to his table and picked up a document. Officer Palmer, I'd like to show you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit A. Do you recognize this? Palmer glanced at the paper Isaiah handed him, his expression growing even more uncomfortable. It appears to be a police report. Specifically, it's the police report you filed regarding this incident. Is that correct? Yes. Can you read the third paragraph aloud for the jury? Palmer cleared his throat nervously. Subject was observed loitering in front of Murphy's Electronics at approximately 9:15 p.m. When approached for questioning, subject became hostile and refused to cooperate with lawful police investigation. Thank you, Isaiah said, taking the report back. Officer Palmer, what time did you actually encounter my client? Around 9:15, as stated in the report. Are you certain about that time? Yes. Isaiah moved back to his table and retrieved another document. Officer Palmer, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit B. This is the receipt found in my client's possession when you arrested him. Can you tell the jury what time is printed on this receipt? Palmer studied the receipt, his face growing increasingly pale. It says 9:05 p.m. 9:05 p.m., Isaiah repeated for emphasis. So my client purchased ice cream at 9:05 p.m. and you encountered him at 9:15 p.m. The store where he made this purchase is exactly 4 blocks from where you arrested him. Officer Palmer, how long would it take someone to walk 4 blocks? I don't know exactly. Would you say it's possible to walk 4 blocks in 10 minutes? Palmer nodded reluctantly. Yes, so my client's location and timing are entirely consistent with his story about buying ice cream and walking home to his mother, aren't they? It's possible, Palmer admitted grudgingly. More than possible, Officer Palmer. The evidence proves he was telling the truth, doesn't it? Hayes stood again. Objection, argumentative. Sustained, but Isaiah had made his point. He returned to his notes, preparing for his final line of questioning. Officer Palmer, you mentioned that the area has experienced increased break-ins recently. How many of those break-ins occurred during evening hours? Palmer looked confused by the change of direction. I'm not sure. Would it surprise you to know that according to crime statistics for your district, over 80% of break-ins occur between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when businesses and homes are most likely to be unoccupied? I wouldn't know those specific statistics. So a man walking past a closed business at 9:15 p.m. would actually be an unusual time for someone to be casing it for a burglary, wouldn't it? Palmer's jaw worked soundlessly as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't further damage his credibility. Officer Palmer, Isaiah continued relentlessly, in your experience, do burglars typically carry bags of ice cream while casing potential targets? A few members of the jury actually smiled at the absurdity of the question, and Palmer's face flushed even deeper. No, he admitted quietly. Do they usually make purchases at nearby stores immediately before committing crimes, leaving paper trails that directly connect them to the area? No. And do they typically tell officers their real names and addresses when questioned? Palmer's voice was barely audible. No. Isaiah paused, letting the weight of these admissions settle over the courtroom. Officer Palmer, let me ask you directly. Looking back on this incident, knowing what you know now about the evidence, do you still believe my client was engaged in criminal activity when you encountered him? The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Palmer's eyes darted around the courtroom, seeking escape from a trap that was entirely of his own making. We acted on the information we had at the time, he said finally. That's not what I asked, Isaiah pressed. Based on the evidence, the ice cream, the receipt, the timing, the location, do you believe my client was engaged in criminal activity? Palmer's silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Judge Hartwell intervened. The witness will answer the question. No, Palmer whispered so quietly that several jury members leaned forward to hear him. I'm sorry, Officer Palmer, could you repeat that for the jury? Palmer's voice cracked as he spoke louder. No, the evidence suggests he was not engaged in criminal activity. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Hartwell gavelled for order, but the damage was complete and irreversible. Hayes looked like a man who had just watched his political career go up in flames, while Isaiah maintained his professional composure despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. No further questions, Your Honor, Isaiah said, returning to his seat with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Palmer stumbled from the witness stand, his massive frame somehow diminished by the weight of truth that had been extracted from him. As he passed Mitchell in the gallery, the detective's face was a mask of barely controlled rage and growing panic. Judge Hartwell called for a brief recess, and as the jury filed out, the courtroom buzzed with animated conversation. The prosecution's case hadn't just taken a hit, it had been completely destroyed by the testimony of their own witnesses. But the day's revelations were far from over. What no one in that courtroom yet realized was that the most explosive testimony was still to come, and when it did, it would transform this simple criminal trial into a federal case that would reverberate through the halls of power in Washington, D.C. The late afternoon light filtered through the courtroom windows with a golden intensity that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space but the moral dimensions of what was unfolding. Judge Hartwell had called the court back into session after a recess that had buzzed with speculation and whispered conversations, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what was about to transpire. Isaiah stood at the defense table, his bearing transformed from the nervous energy of the morning into something approaching quiet confidence. The cross-examinations of Mitchell and Palmer had gone better than he had dared hope, but he knew that destroying the prosecution's case was only half the battle. Now came the moment to present the truth in all its startling complexity. Your Honor, Isaiah said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom, the defense calls Damon Clark to the stand. The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the gallery. It was unusual for defendants to testify in their own behalf, particularly in cases where the prosecution's evidence was clearly falling apart. But Isaiah had learned something about his client during their months of preparation that told him this testimony would be unlike anything the court had ever witnessed. Damon rose slowly from the defense table, his movements deliberate and composed. As he walked toward the witness stand, every eye in the courtroom followed him, and more than a few observers noted something indefinable about his bearing that seemed to fill the space around him with authority. He was sworn in with the same ceremony that had marked the previous witnesses, But there was something different about the way he placed his hand on the Bible, something that suggested this oath carried particular weight for him. His voice, when he spoke the words of commitment to truth, resonated with a depth and sincerity that seemed to reach every corner of the courtroom. "Mr. Clark," Isaiah began once his client was seated, "please state your full name and occupation for the record." Damon's gaze swept the courtroom briefly before settling on the jury. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of command, though tempered with respect for the setting and the gravity of the moment. "My name is Damon Marcus Clark," he said clearly. "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words fell into the courtroom like a bomb detonating in slow motion. For several seconds, absolute silence reigned as the magnitude of what had just been revealed sank into the consciousness of everyone present. Then, as if a dam had burst, the courtroom erupted in gasps, exclamations, and the scraping of chairs as people turned to stare at each other in disbelief. Judge Hartwell's gavel rang out repeatedly as she called for order, but it took several minutes for the chaos to subside. In the gallery, Detective Mitchell had gone completely white, his mouth hanging open in shock. Officer Palmer looked as if he might be sick, his face a greenish pale that suggested the full implications of their actions were beginning to dawn on him. District Attorney Hayes sat frozen at the prosecution table, his political instincts warring with his legal training as he tried to process what this revelation meant for his case, his career, and his future. The carefully constructed narrative he had built around this prosecution was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from Captain Lewis and the other officers who had come to support Mitchell and Palmer. Lewis looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension of the catastrophe that was about to engulf their department. "Mr. Clark," Isaiah continued once order had been restored, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding, "how long have you served as director of the FBI?" "3 years," Damon replied, his composure unshaken by the chaos his revelation had caused. "I was appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate in 2021. And prior to your appointment as director, what was your background in law enforcement?" Damon's response was delivered with the same calm authority that marked all his statements. "I served for 20 years as a special agent with the Bureau, working in counterterrorism, organized crime, and public corruption investigations. I held various supervisory positions, including Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigative Division, before my appointment as Director." "Mr. Clark, can you tell the court about your educational background?" "I graduated from West Point with a degree in criminal justice, served 5 years as an officer in the U.S. Army, then earned a law degree from Georgetown University before joining the FBI." Isaiah paused, allowing the jury to absorb the full implications of his client's background. Here was not just an innocent man, but one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country, a man whose word carried weight in the highest circles of government. "Mr. Clark, on the evening of September 15th, why were you in the Riverside neighborhood?" Damon's expression softened slightly as he spoke about his mother. "I was visiting my mother, who lives in the house where I grew up. She's 83 years old and lives alone. I try to visit her regularly to help with maintenance around the house and just to spend time with her." "And what were you doing when Officers Mitchell and Palmer approached you?" "I had just purchased vanilla ice cream from the corner store, her favorite flavor. It's something of a tradition between us. Whenever I visit, I bring her ice cream. I was walking back to her house when the patrol car pulled up." "Mr. Clark, when the officers first approached you, did you consider identifying yourself?" Damon paused thoughtfully before answering, his response revealing the careful consideration he had given to this question. "I did consider it. I could have ended the encounter immediately by showing my credentials, but I realized that this moment represented something larger than just my personal convenience." "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "As FBI director, I receive reports daily about incidents exactly like this one. Citizens, particularly citizens of color, being harassed, detained, and arrested without cause. I realized that revealing my identity would solve my immediate problem, but would do nothing to address the systemic issues that allow such encounters to occur regularly. Isaiah nodded, guiding his client toward the heart of his decision. So, what did you choose to do? I chose to experience the justice system as an ordinary citizen would. I chose to let this encounter play out completely, to gather evidence not just of what happened to me, but of how the system responds when officers violate the constitutional rights of people they assume have no power to fight back. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on Damon's words as he explained the extraordinary decision that had brought them all to this moment. Mr. Clark, at any point during your arrest, processing, or detention, did you reveal your identity? No, I was booked, fingerprinted, and held overnight like any other arrestee. I used my one phone call to contact Mr. Washington, not to summon federal agents to secure my release. Why did you contact me specifically? Your reputation for handling civil rights cases and police misconduct had come to our attention at the Bureau. I knew you would pursue this case based on its merits, not on who I happened to be. Isaiah moved closer to the jury box, his next questions aimed at the heart of the constitutional issues at stake. Mr. Clark, based on your 23 years of experience in law enforcement, do you believe the officers had reasonable suspicion to detain you? Damon's answer was delivered with the authority of someone who had spent decades training agents in constitutional law. Absolutely not. Walking on a public sidewalk, carrying a store receipt and ice cream, in a neighborhood where you have family ties does not constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity under any interpretation of the Fourth Amendment. And did you do anything that would justify your arrest? Nothing whatsoever. I answered their questions truthfully, complied with their requests to search my person and belongings, and remained calm and respectful throughout the encounter. The only thing I did that apparently offended these officers was ask why I was being detained, which is not only my right but a question any citizen should feel free to ask. Isaiah paused, preparing for what he knew would be the most powerful part of the testimony. Mr. Clark, I want to ask you about something we discovered during our investigation. Are you aware that your arrest was recorded? A murmur ran through the courtroom as this new revelation sank in. Damon nodded calmly. Yes, the patrol car's dashboard camera was recording during the entire encounter. And have you reviewed that footage? I have. Mr. Clark, does that footage corroborate your account of what happened? It does. It shows exactly what I've described. A peaceful encounter escalated by officers who had already decided to make an arrest, regardless of evidence or constitutional requirements. Isaiah returned to his table and picked up a DVD. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Defense Exhibit C, the dashboard camera footage from the patrol car involved in this incident. Hayes leaped to his feet, his face flushed with panic. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution was not provided with this evidence during discovery. Judge Hartwell looked toward the defense table with raised eyebrows. Mr. Washington, Your Honor, this evidence was obtained through a federal Freedom of Information Act request filed last week. We provided copies to the prosecution as soon as we received them, which was yesterday afternoon. The prosecution has had adequate time to review the material. The objection is overruled, Judge Hartwell ruled. Proceed with the exhibit. The courtroom's attention focused on the large monitor that had been wheeled into position as the bailiff prepared to play the recording. Damon watched calmly from the witness stand, his expression unchanged, while Detective Mitchell and Officer Palmer looked as if they were watching their own execution. The footage began with the routine view from the patrol car's dashboard, showing the quiet evening street. When the car pulled up beside Damon, the image clearly showed a man walking peacefully with a small bag, presenting no threat or suspicious behavior whatsoever. The audio was crystal clear, and every word of the encounter was preserved in digital clarity. The jury heard Mitchell's opening comment about another troublemaker, his use of the word boy, and Palmer's assumption about criminal activity. They heard Damon's respectful responses, his truthful explanation about visiting his mother, and his reasonable questions about why he was being detained. Most damaging of all, they heard the officers' conversation during the drive to the station when they thought they were speaking privately. "Think this one will stick?" Palmer's voice came clearly through the speakers. "They always stick," Mitchell replied with casual confidence. "Who's going to believe some street thug over two sworn officers? We'll get our commendations and move on to the next one." "Just another night keeping the streets safe," Palmer laughed. The recording captured their complete confidence that their version of events would be accepted without question, their assumption that the man they had arrested was powerless to challenge their narrative. The casual way they discussed fabricating charges revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond this single incident. When the footage ended, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. The evidence was so overwhelming, so clearly demonstrative of misconduct, that even Mitchell's supporters seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. "Mr. Clark," Isaiah continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "what did you think when you heard that conversation?" "I thought about how many other innocent people had been victimized by these officers, and how many more would be if this pattern was allowed to continue," Damon replied. "I thought about my oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I realized that sometimes the greatest threats to our constitutional rights come from those sworn to protect them." Isaiah moved toward his final questions, knowing that what came next would transform this trial from a local criminal matter into a federal case with national implications. "Mr. Clark, has the FBI opened an investigation into this incident?" "Yes. Based on the evidence gathered during this case, the Bureau has opened a comprehensive civil rights investigation into the practices of the Atlanta Police Department, with particular focus on the precinct where officers Mitchell and Palmer work." The announcement hit the courtroom like another bombshell. Captain Lewis looked as if he might have a heart attack, while other officers began whispering urgently among themselves. "And what has that investigation revealed so far?" Hayes stood desperately. "Objection! This is far beyond the scope of the current charges." "Your Honor," Isaiah responded calmly, "the defendant's professional background and the federal investigation it has prompted are directly relevant to understanding both his credibility and the broader context of the misconduct he experienced." Judge Hartwell considered for a moment before ruling. "I'll allow it, but keep it relevant to the current charges, Mr. Washington." "Mr. Clark, what has the federal investigation revealed?" Damon's answer was delivered with the measured tone of an official briefing, but its content was explosive. "Our investigation has identified a pattern of constitutional violations by multiple officers in that precinct, including false arrests, evidence fabrication, and systematic harassment of minority communities. We have documented over 40 cases in the past 2 years that follow the same pattern as my experience." 40 cases, Isaiah repeated for emphasis. "Mr. Clark, in your professional opinion, do officers Mitchell and Palmer represent isolated bad actors, or are they part of a larger systemic problem?" "Based on our investigation, they are part of a culture of misconduct that has been allowed to flourish due to inadequate supervision, training, and accountability. This is not a case of two officers making a mistake. This is a case of institutional failure that has enabled systematic violations of citizens' rights." Isaiah paused, preparing for his final question. "Mr. Clark, why didn't you simply reveal your identity and end this ordeal months ago?" Damon's answer would be quoted in newspapers and legal journals for years to come. "Because justice that depends on who you are is not justice at all. Every citizen, regardless of their position or power, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement. If I had used my position to escape accountability for these officers' actions, I would have been complicit in a system that denies justice to those without federal badges to flash." "No further questions, Your Honor," Isaiah said, returning to his seat with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just delivered one of the most powerful direct examinations in legal history. But as Damon remained on the witness stand, awaiting cross-examination, Everyone in the courtroom understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. This was no longer just a criminal trial. It had become a moment of reckoning that would redefine the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And in the back of the courtroom, Detective Mitchell and Officer Palmer sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that they had not just arrested the wrong man, they had awakened a sleeping giant whose commitment to justice would ensure that their actions would have consequences they had never imagined possible. The cross-examination that everyone expected never came. District Attorney Hayes rose slowly from his table, his face bearing the expression of a man who had just realized that his political career was about to end in spectacular fashion. He looked toward Damon, who sat calmly in the witness stand with the bearing of someone completely comfortable with the truth, then toward the jury, whose expressions ranged from shock to admiration to barely contained anger at the misconduct that had been revealed. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the prosecution has no questions for this witness." The admission echoed through the courtroom like a final nail being driven into a coffin. Hayes had built his career on law and order rhetoric, on standing behind police officers and prosecuting those who challenged their authority. But faced with the reality of what Mitchell and Palmer had done, and the catastrophic implications of having prosecuted the director of the FBI for asking questions while walking with ice cream, even his political instincts told him that retreat was the only option. Judge Hartwell nodded gravely. "Mr. Clark, you may step down." As Damon returned to the defense table, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. The weight of what had been revealed seemed to press down on everyone present, transforming what had begun as a routine criminal trial into something approaching a constitutional crisis. "Mr. Washington," Judge Hartwell continued, "do you have any additional witnesses?" Isaiah stood, consulting his notes one final time. "Your Honor, the defense calls Special Agent Sarah Chen." The announcement brought another murmur of surprise from the gallery. A young Asian woman in a crisp business suit rose from the back of the courtroom and made her way to the witness stand with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to testifying in federal court. After being sworn in, Agent Chen identified herself as a senior special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, assigned to investigate pattern and practice violations by law enforcement agencies. "Agent Chen," Isaiah began, "are you familiar with the federal investigation into the Atlanta Police Department that Director Clark referenced in his testimony?" "Yes, I am the lead investigator on that case." "And what has your investigation revealed about Officers Mitchell and Palmer specifically?" Agent Chen consulted a thick folder before responding. "Our investigation has documented 17 separate incidents involving Officer Palmer and 12 involving Detective Mitchell, where civilians were arrested on questionable charges that were later dismissed or resulted in acquittals. In each case, the pattern was identical to what happened to Director Clark: initial contact without reasonable suspicion, escalation by the officers, and arrests for charges like resisting arrest or disorderly conduct that appear to have been fabricated." "Agent Chen, has your investigation uncovered any evidence of coordination between these officers in filing false reports?" "Yes. We have identified multiple instances where Officers Mitchell and Palmer filed nearly identical reports using the same unusual phraseology, despite claiming to have witnessed events independently. This suggests a pattern of collaboration in creating false narratives to justify questionable arrests." The testimony continued for 20 minutes, with Agent Chen methodically laying out a federal case that would likely result in civil rights charges against both officers and potentially their supervisors. The scope of the misconduct was staggering, affecting dozens of families and undermining public trust in law enforcement throughout the community. When Agent Chen stepped down, Judge Hartwell looked toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to present any rebuttal testimony?" Hayes stood slowly, his political instincts finally overcoming his shock at the morning's revelations. "Your Honor, in light of the testimony we have heard today, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Clark." The words brought a collective gasp from the courtroom, followed by scattered applause that Judge Hartwell quickly gavelled down. But the legal implications of the dismissal went far beyond this single case. Furthermore, Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger as he embraced his only viable political strategy, the prosecution will be referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for investigation of potential criminal charges against the arresting officers. It was a complete capitulation, a public admission that the prosecution had brought charges against an innocent man based on the fabricated reports of corrupt officers. For Hayes, it represented the only path to political survival, positioning himself as a crusader for justice rather than an enabler of misconduct. Judge Hartwell accepted the motion to dismiss, formally ending the criminal case against Damon Clark. But as the courtroom began to empty, everyone understood that this conclusion was really just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded with reporters, federal agents, and community members who had gathered as word of the trial's extraordinary developments spread throughout the city. Detective Mitchell and Officer Palmer, flanked by union representatives and criminal defense attorneys, pushed through the crowd without comment, their faces grim with the knowledge that their law enforcement careers were over and federal prosecution was likely imminent. Damon stood at the podium that had been hastily erected for the press conference, his bearing transformed from defendant back to federal law enforcement director. The questions came rapidly from the assembled reporters, but his answers were measured and focused on the broader implications of what had occurred. This case demonstrates why federal oversight of local law enforcement is not just necessary but essential, he said in response to a question about the FBI's investigation. When officers believe they can violate citizens' rights without consequence, when they assume that their word will always be believed over that of the people they arrest, the entire foundation of constitutional law enforcement begins to crumble. A reporter called out, "Director Clark, do you regret not identifying yourself during the arrest?" Damon paused thoughtfully before responding. "I regret that it was necessary to experience this injustice in order to expose it, but I do not regret allowing the system to show its true face. Justice that depends on who you are, justice that changes based on your position or connections, is not justice at all. Every citizen deserves to be treated with the same respect and dignity that these officers would have shown me if they had known my position." What message do you hope this case sends to law enforcement officers nationwide? The message is simple. The Constitution applies to every encounter with every citizen, regardless of their race, their neighborhood, or their apparent social status. Officers who violate their oath, who fabricate evidence or file false reports, will be held accountable under federal law. There is no community too small, no department too powerful, and no misconduct too routine to escape federal scrutiny. The press conference continued for 30 minutes, with Damon fielding questions about everything from the specifics of the federal investigation to the broader implications for police reform. His responses were those of a seasoned law enforcement professional, but there was also something personal in his tone, the voice of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand and was determined to ensure it never happened again. 3 months later, Detective Ryan Mitchell and Officer Scott Palmer were indicted on federal civil rights charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, filing false reports, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The evidence against them was overwhelming, built not just on Damon's case, but on the dozens of similar incidents uncovered by the federal investigation. Both officers eventually pleaded guilty rather than face trial, receiving sentences of 3 years in federal prison. Captain Lewis was forced into early retirement after the investigation revealed his knowledge of and failure to address the pattern of misconduct in his precinct. The Atlanta Police Department entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice, requiring comprehensive reforms to training, supervision, and accountability procedures. The changes would cost millions of dollars and take years to implement, but they represented a fundamental shift in how the department approached community policing. District Attorney Hayes, despite his last-minute conversion to reform, lost his re-election bid by a substantial margin. Voters seemed unimpressed by his claim to have heroically dismissed charges against an innocent man after prosecuting him for months based on fabricated evidence. Isaiah Washington's career took a dramatically different trajectory. His handling of the case brought him to national attention, and he was eventually recruited to head the Civil Rights Division of a major federal public interest organization. The trial had transformed him from a promising young attorney into one of the country's leading experts on police misconduct litigation. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on federal law enforcement policy itself. Damon used his experience to push through new initiatives requiring federal monitoring of local law enforcement agencies, expanded civil rights enforcement, and mandatory training on constitutional law for officers at all levels. The case became a touchstone in legal education, studied in law schools as an example of how individual acts of courage could catalyze systemic change. But it also served as a reminder of how deeply entrenched patterns of misconduct could become when they operated without oversight or accountability. 6 months after the trial, Damon made an unannounced visit to his mother's neighborhood. He parked several blocks away and walked the same route he had taken that September evening, past the same corner store where he had bought ice cream, past the spot where Mitchell and Palmer had decided he looked suspicious enough to arrest. The neighborhood looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. The federal investigation had led to the transfer or termination of a dozen officers from the local precinct, and new community policing initiatives had begun to rebuild trust between law enforcement and residents. As he walked, several neighbors recognized him and stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for what he had done. An elderly woman who had witnessed his arrest from her porch told him that she had wanted to intervene that night but had been afraid of the officer's reaction. "You gave us our voices back," she said simply. "Now when we see something wrong, we know someone will listen." Damon continued his walk to his mother's house, where she was waiting on the porch with 2 bowls and a container of vanilla ice cream. At 83, she had lived through enough history to understand the significance of what her son had accomplished, but her pride was tempered by sadness at the injustice that had made his sacrifice necessary. "I'm proud of you," she said as they sat together in the evening light. "But I wish you hadn't had to go through all that just to prove what should have been obvious to everyone." "Sometimes," Damon replied, spooning ice cream into the bowls, "the obvious things are the hardest to see. Sometimes it takes something dramatic to make people pay attention to what's been happening all along." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Children played in nearby yards while their parents sat on porches, catching up on the day's events. It was a scene of normalcy that had been restored through extraordinary means, a community that had reclaimed its peace through one man's willingness to endure injustice in order to expose it. As the sun set behind the modest houses and tree-lined streets, Damon reflected on the journey that had brought him from that humiliating arrest to this moment of quiet victory. The case had cost him months of stress, legal fees, and public scrutiny, but it had also accomplished something that decades of federal investigations and policy initiatives had failed to achieve. It had put a human face on police misconduct and made it impossible for people to look away. The evening air carried the sounds of a neighborhood at peace, children's laughter, the distant hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing slowly down the residential street. These were the sounds that had been absent that September night when fear had settled over the community like a suffocating blanket, when residents had watched from behind curtains as 2 officers violated the rights of a man whose only crime was walking while black. "You know," his mother said, breaking the silence, "your father would have been proud too. He always said that real courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you are afraid." Damon nodded, thinking about the father he had lost to cancer when he was just starting his FBI career, a man who had worked 2 jobs to put his son through college, who had instilled in him the values that had guided him through that terrible night and the months that followed. He would have told me to finish my ice cream before it melted, Damon replied with a smile, earning a laugh from his mother. As they finished their evening treat, Damon's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Isaiah, informing him that the consent decree negotiations with the Atlanta Police Department had been finalized. The reforms would be comprehensive, touching every aspect of police training, supervision, and accountability. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. Another message followed, this one from Agent Chen. The federal investigation had identified 3 more officers whose patterns of misconduct warranted prosecution. The ripple effects of that September night were still spreading, still bringing accountability to those who had assumed they were beyond reach. But perhaps the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source, a young man named Marcus Williams, whose wrongful arrest by Mitchell and Palmer 2 years earlier had been dismissed after the federal investigation uncovered the fabricated evidence. He was starting his freshman year at Georgia Tech on a full scholarship, his dreams restored by the justice that had finally caught up with the officers who had tried to derail his life. "Thank you for not letting them get away with it," the message read. "Thank you for showing that the truth matters." As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Damon prepared to leave, knowing that he would return again soon, but that this visit had served its purpose. He had needed to walk these streets again as a free man, to see the community healing, to understand that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. The drive back to his downtown apartment took him past the federal courthouse where the trial had unfolded, its imposing facade now lit by spotlights that cast long shadows across the marble steps. Those steps had witnessed countless struggles for justice over the decades, but few as dramatic or consequential as the case that had transformed a simple criminal trial into a national reckoning with police accountability. The following Monday, Damon returned to FBI headquarters in Washington, where his experience had elevated him from an administrator focused on national security threats to a leader whose personal understanding of civil rights violations had transformed the Bureau's approach to police misconduct cases. The morning briefing included updates on 17 different federal investigations into local law enforcement agencies, each one building on the precedent established by his case. The legal framework that had allowed Mitchell and Palmer to operate with impunity was being systematically dismantled, one case at a time. "Director," Agent Chen said during the briefing, "we're getting reports from community organizations across the country that people are more willing to report police misconduct now. They're saying your case showed them that someone would actually listen." It was exactly the outcome Damon had hoped for when he made the decision to let that September night play out to its conclusion. The real victory wasn't just holding 2 corrupt officers accountable, it was restoring faith in the idea that justice was possible even for those who had given up hope. 3 years later, the transformation was even more pronounced. The consent decree had reduced complaints against Atlanta police officers by 60%, while community trust in law enforcement had risen to levels not seen in decades. Similar patterns were emerging in cities across the country where federal interventions had forced accountability and reform. Detective Mitchell was released from federal prison after serving his full sentence. His law enforcement career permanently ended and his pension forfeited. He had aged considerably during his incarceration, the weight of his crimes and their consequences etched into his features. His attempts to find work were complicated by the notoriety of his case, which had become a textbook example of how racial bias and abuse of power could destroy both communities and the officers who perpetrated it. Officer Palmer faced similar challenges upon his release, though he had shown more genuine remorse during his imprisonment and had participated in programs designed to help former officers understand the impact of their misconduct on the communities they had sworn to serve. Both men would carry the consequences of that September night for the rest of their lives, their names forever associated with a case that had exposed the worst impulses of law enforcement and the potential for redemption when justice finally prevailed. But the most lasting legacy of the case was not the punishment of the guilty, it was the empowerment of the innocent. Across the country, citizens who had previously felt powerless in the face of police misconduct began to demand accountability. Community organizations used Damon's example to train residents on their rights during police encounters. Law schools incorporated the case into their civil rights curricula as a demonstration of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. The case had also fundamentally altered the relationship between federal and local law enforcement. The assumption that local police misconduct was purely a local matter had been shattered, replaced by an understanding that constitutional violations anywhere were a federal concern that warranted federal intervention. On the 5th anniversary of his arrest, Damon was invited to speak at a conference on police reform hosted by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. His speech was carried live on national television, reaching millions of Americans who had followed his story and its aftermath. 5 years ago, he told the audience, I made a choice to experience injustice rather than escape it. I chose to trust in a system that had failed so many others, to believe that truth would ultimately prevail over power. Today, I can tell you that choice was vindicated, not because I received justice, but because that experience opened the door for justice for countless others. The speech concluded with a challenge that would resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. Real change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from citizens who refuse to accept injustice, who demand accountability, and who understand that their rights are only as strong as their willingness to defend them. Every person in this room has the power to be an agent of change. The question is whether you will choose to exercise it. As Damon left the podium to thunderous applause, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple walk to buy ice cream for his mother. The path from that humiliating arrest to this moment of triumph had been longer and more difficult than he could have imagined, but it had proven something that he had always believed but never been able to demonstrate so clearly: that justice, while often delayed, could not be permanently denied when good people refused to accept defeat. The case of Director Damon Clark would be studied, debated, and cited for generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of systemic failure, individual acts of courage could light the way toward redemption. It had shown that the arc of the moral universe, while long, did indeed bend toward justice, but only when brave people were willing to bend it themselves. And in a modest house in Atlanta, an 88-year-old woman kept a newspaper clipping about her son's case tucked in her Bible, a testament to the power of doing what's right even when the cost seems too high to bear. She had raised him to believe that justice was worth fighting for, and he had proven that sometimes the most important battles are won not by those who never fall, but by those who choose to stand back up. The neighborhood where it all began continued to thrive, its streets safe not because of fear, but because of mutual respect between law enforcement and the community. Children played in the same yards where their parents had once watched in terror as innocent people were arrested for no crime greater than existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. It was a transformation that had cost everything and changed everything, proving that sometimes the highest price of justice is the willingness to suffer injustice long enough to expose it to the light. And in that exposure, in that moment when truth finally overwhelmed power, a nation had been reminded of its highest ideals and its obligation to make them real for every citizen, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The ice cream had long since melted on that September night 5 years ago, but the sweetness of justice served had proven far more satisfying and infinitely more lasting.